Yes.
Okay, good. It's not used to a microphone. I've been asked to ask you first if you have your cell phone to please silence it before we get started.
Could I get you to move this way towards the camera?
Talk into the mic there.
You don't need me in this, but okay, here we go.
Swallow the mic.
Swallow the mic. Okay, well, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the evening, Nancy Collins. Nancy and I have been friends for a long time. We met when we were both teaching at St. Andrew's Episcopal School. Nancy taught Latin. You can't hear me?
Is it on? It's on. Hold it up.
Put it up on your mouth.
Right there?
Yeah.
You want me to start over?
Yeah.
All right. Did you hear about the cell phones? Okay, just fine. All right.
Hey, talk slow. Talk slow.
Let her talk. Jesus.
All right. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Nancy Collins. Nancy and I met at St. Andrew's Episcopal School, where we both taught. She taught Latin, I taught art, but we still are good friends now. Nancy and Jack have been residents for Boston for a long time, and involved in numerous civic activities. And about 12 years ago, they went to Taos. They vacationed in Taos and fell in love with the area. And so they are now kind of part-time residents of Taos as well as Austin. And Nancy is an accomplished artist, and she soon delved into all of the art that Taos has to offer, both what's there and also the history there, and the artist and art enthusiast over the years. And one of the most interesting and colorful supporters of the arts is Mabel Luhan, and that is the topic of her talk this evening. So please welcome Nancy Collins.
Thank you, Mary Lynn.
Thank you, Mary Lynn, for introducing me. As Mary Lynn mentioned, Jack and I have spent summers in Taos for some time. And several years ago, when we got there, there was an exhibit about Mabel Luhan at the Harwood Museum. And we went in early June to see it, and were very impressed and learned a lot. And a couple of weeks later, we had a house guest who also wanted to see it. So we went again to the Mabel Luhan exhibit. And a few weeks later, once again, we had house guests. We learned a long time ago that the hotter the summers were in Texas, the more visitors we had in Taos. And I think that was a very hot summer, because by the time the summer in Taos was over, I had seen the Mabel Luhan exhibit 12 or 13 times. That does not make me an expert, but it certainly made me learn a little bit about her, and that's what I want to share with you tonight. She was born in 1879 in Buffalo, New York, to a very wealthy family of the Gilded Age. Mabel chafed under the restrictions of her Victorian upbringing. She was mostly reared by nursemaids and nannies at home. Her father didn't really like children, he preferred his dogs, and her mother was not very affectionate. In fact, Mabel said in her memoirs that she had tried to kiss the Mother Goose figures on the wallpaper in her nursery to get a little kind of affection. Perhaps it's not surprising that she rebelled against this upbringing. In this upper-class, well-to-do Buffalo society, young women were expected to make their debuts when they got to be about 18 years old. But of course, Mabel said no, she would not do that. So they said, well, all right, we'll have whatever kind of party you want. She said, okay, we'll have a costume party. She would prefer that. But they did have a costume party, and she refused to dance at her party, so it was not a very big success. This is the house in which she was born in Buffalo. And here is Mabel in the dress she was supposed to wear to her debutante party. first marriage to Carl Evans was entered into partly to make her father mad and partly as a lark, because at the time, Carl Evans was already engaged to another woman. And Mabel thought that was kind of a challenge to try to take Carl away. And she succeeded in taking him away from his fiancée, Elise. It's doubtful that she even loved him, but they were married in 1900. They had one son named John in 1902. And though Mabel enjoyed being pregnant, she wasn't very much excited about being a mom. Here are a couple of slides of the not-so-happy family. Carl Evans was killed in a hunting accident when John was still a little boy. And Mabel's family decided to send her to Europe, partly to get her over her depression, but as well to get her away from home and the gynecologist with whom she was having an affair. On the ship to France, Mabel met Edwin Dodge, an architect from a wealthy Boston family. She wasn't in love with him, but he was good to her son, and she needed a father figure for John. She and Edwin married and moved to Florence, where they bought a magnificent 15th century Medici estate. They spent another small fortune redecorating it, updating it, and hanging art. And they began to collect interesting people as well as art, and soon established a salon of artists, writers, actors, and singers. In 1911, the French painter Jacques-Emile Blanche came to the Villa Coronia and painted a portrait of Mabel in a turban costume with her son John. Mabel began to be celebrated in her role as a muse and as an inspiration for artists and thinkers. In addition, she began collecting lovers. Kept her busy. It was maybe platonic, but the stimulus of the chase appealed to her. She was romantically involved with her son's tutor, with her chauffeur, with one of the Medicis, and with a famous tenor. There were undoubtedly others, as she sought to make up for the lack of affection in her young life. It was during this period that Mabel met Gertrude and Leo Stein, sister and brother, who were instrumental in converting her to modernism and post-impressionism in the arts. They taught her that an individual could make herself anew and overcome bonds of heredity and environment. Gertrude Stein was so taken with Mabel that she wrote a word portrait of Mabel in a prose style, and when Mabel finally returned to the U.S., she had copies made to sell at the Armory Show in New York City. Gertrude's writing received publicity, but Mabel got most of the attention. Finally, Edwin Dodge insisted that they return permanently to the United States. And so Mabel, Edwin, and John moved into a Washington Square apartment on Fifth Avenue in New York City, which was on the edge of Greenwich Village, the heartland of America's avant-garde at the time. Edwin and John were happy to be back in the U.S., but Mabel, after redecorating the apartment, was bored and became depressed. She convinced her psychiatrist that it was Edwin who was causing her stress, so she made him move into a hotel, citing doctor's orders. Edwin tried to cheer her up by bringing friends over, and they in turn brought friends, and soon her apartment became a salon for a group of free-thinking men and women who argue for aesthetic, sexual, political, social, and economic reform. Mabel was a centralizing, magnetic personality with the ability to stimulate conversation, and yet no one thought they were being managed. Her salons gained national fame, and a full-page spread on the Salon Dodge appeared in a New York paper in 1914. Her guests included Alfred Stieglitz, Walter Lippmann, Emma Gold, Margaret Sanger, and many of the movers and shakers of the day. She wrote a column for a leading radical magazine, which was titled The Masses. She posted bond for people who were jailed for socialism. She gave money to starving artists. She sent a young stage designer with emotional difficulties to Zurich to be analyzed by Carl Jung. And after Margaret Sanger was arrested for distributing birth control, Mabel opened her home for meetings of the Sanger Defense Committee. She conceived of the 1913 Patterson Strike pageant at Madison Square Garden, which reenacted the oppression and police brutality that were suffered by silk workers on strike in Patterson. It was during her work on this pageant that she began her affair with John Reed. He was a young, handsome, socialist writer, poet, and journalist, and he was the subject of the movie Reds, starring Warren Beatty, which you might have seen a few years ago. They traveled together to Europe on the eve of World War I because Reed was reporting on the war. Mabel herself wrote a powerful piece published in the magazine The Masses in November 1914 after she interviewed the wives of the soldiers, and she ended her article with this statement: "The only hope of permanent peace lies in a woman's war against war." This was the motivation for the founding of the Women's Peace Party and of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom that Jane Addams helped organize in 1915 to unite the world's women against war. Mabel returned to the U.S., but John Reed remained in Europe to cover the war. Their tempestuous relationship continued off and on until October 1915, when Mabel took a new lover, Maurice Stern. And she was finally served divorce papers by the long-suffering Edwin Dodge in 1916. It was during this period that Mabel began to question why she had such a compulsive desire to realize herself through men. And she began therapy with Dr. A.A. Brill, a Freudian psychologist who was considered the head of the psychoanalytic movement in the United States. After reading one of Mabel's pieces that she had published in The Masses, Dr. Brill encouraged her to write. And write she did, becoming a syndicated columnist on such topics as decorating, home life, libraries, psychology, and professional counseling. During her lifetime, she wrote 7 books as well about her life in New York, Italy, and New Mexico. During her stint as a syndicated columnist on home life, she met a nun who suggested that she would show more responsibility and more credibility to her readers if she would marry Maurice Stern, and they married in August 1917. Maurice Stern had begun his career as a painter and draftsman by studying at the National Academy of Design, and then traveled in Europe and the Far East and settled in Bali for a while to paint. His relationship with Mabel was mutually exploitative. He needed financial security, and she still thought she needed a man to give her identity. Maurice Stern was a fine painter. This painting by Maurice Stern is in the Phillips collection. But Mabel thought she could make him over to be a sculptor rather than a painter, and suggested that he should travel to the southwestern part of the U.S., where she had been told that artists were finding new inspiration. So Stern set up a studio in Santa Fe and soon wrote to Mabel to encourage her to join him. He said, "Do you want an object in life? Save the Indians, their art, their culture, and reveal it to the world." So she set out to join him in December 1917. And the journey from New York to Santa Fe in those days was not an easy one. It was 3 days and nights on a train, and then Stern picked her up and took her to his lodgings, which was really a mud hovel. After a short time in Santa Fe, Mabel became restless, and she hired a car to take them to Taos, which was not an easy trip either in those days. It was a precarious all-day trip on poor roads through uninhabited spaces with sage, brush, and pinon trees. But despite the cold and the dark and the lack of suitable lodging in Taos, Mabel felt at home in New Mexico. In fact, she poignantly wrote, "My life broke in two right then, and I entered the second half, a new world that replaced all the ways I had known with others, more strange and terrible and sweet than any I had been able to imagine." She found a crazy Englishman in Taos who was willing to rent them a house, and she set about exploring Taos and the Tiwa Pueblo. The culture of the Tiwas seemed to Mabel the antithesis of her life up till now, and the timelessness and the stability of their tribal lifestyle contrasted with the chaos of her life. She found great significance in tribal dances and in the celebration of Earth Mother and Sun Father. She volunteered to help the Pueblo women learn to knit. She wrapped herself in shawls. She cut her hair to look more like an Indian. And she attempted to adopt the soft-spoken and orderly ways of the women. And then she met Antonio Luhan, a full-blooded Pueblo Indian. By all accounts, it was immediately a mutual attraction. Tony was tall, handsome, calm, and solid emotionally and physically. He was happy to drive Mabel, her husband Maurice, and her son John around the countryside to show them other Indian villages and dances and to explain the Pueblo way of life. Meanwhile, Maurice Stern was working on sculptures, many of Indians from the Pueblo, though he was beginning to get a little suspicious of his wife's interest in Tony Luhan. She, though, insisted that the relationship was platonic, at least until Maurice returned to New York in August. Mabel and Maurice continued to correspond, and she assumed he would return to Taos. He mentioned divorce the following spring, and she said she would cut off his monthly retainer if he filed. So he continued to receive monthly income from her until December 1922, when they were officially divorced. Maurice Stern became very well known, and today his works are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Phillips Collection, the Cochrane, and the Art Institute of Chicago. And there is an interesting story behind this sculpture by Maurice Stern. This is Antonio Mirabal, who was a member of the tribe at Pueblo, and after a long search by this man's grandson, who was a resident of Taos and a resident of the Pueblo, his name was Jonathan Warm Day Cumming. I just love that name, Jonathan Warm Day Cumming. And he knew that there was a sculpture by Maurice Stern somewhere, and he began to search for it, and finally found it in the storage area of the Chicago Art Institute, and it was acquired by the Harvard Museum about 4 years ago, so it now lives in Taos. Mabel and Tony's relationship went through a number of complications, including the fact that he had a Pueblo wife named Candelaria, and that intermarriage was forbidden by tribal law. When Tony and Mabel married in 1923, he had to give up participation in Kiva ceremonies, but he did retain his position with the tribal council, and he continued to have a great deal of influence on the Tiwa Pueblo and with other tribes. The deep bond of affection and devotion between Tony and Mabel lasted for the rest of their lives. Before they were married, he encouraged her to buy meadowland in 1918 and he built her the first real home she'd ever had, Los Gallos. And I know some of you have been to this house. It's called Los Gallos because there are roosters up on the tops of the corners of the building. Mabel designed the interior, and Tony fitted the adobe bricks together to make a large kitchen, a great room, bedrooms, guest houses, stables, barns, and a gatehouse. And today, as many of you know, it is used as a comfort center, as a nice gift shop, and rooms can be rented by visitors to Taos. One of the rooms at Los Gallos has windows that were painted by writer and artist D.H. Lawrence. Once Mabel fell in love with Taos and with the New Mexico landscape and way of life, she began encouraging artists and writers whom she had known on the East Coast, and some of whom were having trouble making a living in the East. And she encouraged them to come start over again in New Mexico. She promoted the myth of the Southwest as a Garden of Eden, whose climate, terrain, and indigenous people offered cultural renewal for the dying Anglo civilization. Her guest houses began to fill up with artists, writers, movers and shakers whom she had known in the East and abroad. Willa Cather had visited New Mexico long before Mabel arrived, but at Mabel's suggestion, she returned to stay in one of the guest houses over a period of several summers. And it's thought that Cather's depiction of Eusebio in Death Comes for the Archbishop was modeled after the gentle Tony Luhan. D.H. Lawrence and his wife Frida spent time in one of Mabel's guest houses over a couple of summers, until the friction between D.H. and Mabel became so heated that she finally helped him buy a ranch outside of Taos. Frida, D.H. Lawrence's wife, did not want to owe Mabel anything, so in exchange for the property, Frida gave Mabel Lawrence's handwritten copy of Sons and Lovers. Dorothy Brett, who was a British artist, lived for a time at the ranch, and Mabel, Frida, and Dorothy were sometimes referred to as the Three Fates. Here are the Three Fates. They look like they could be a lot of trouble. There's no question that Mabel had a great deal of influence on D.H. Lawrence, but there is also no question that she infuriated him. In fact, Lawrence said he knew he was capable of murder when he described how he would kill Mabel. And after D.H. Lawrence's death, Mabel wanted the ashes scattered over the ranch, but Frida had them mixed with cement to make a permanent block at the memorial. And today, you can visit the chapel outside of Taos and see the concrete block containing Lawrence's ashes. So Frida did not let Mabel get her hands on those ashes. Marston Hartley, who was a painter of Maine and a friend of Alfred Stieglitz, visited Taos at Mabel's invitation. Hartley was intrigued by the landscape as well as by the Indians, and he began to incorporate Indian symbols in his modernistic works. This is a man who had painted mostly seascapes in Maine, and now he was intrigued by the New Mexico landscape. In 1929, one of Mabel's guest houses housed Ansel Adams, who put aside all thoughts of a concert career to focus on his photography. And he adopted the style of purist photography, concentrating on light and shadow, that brought him fame. His photos of the Taos Pueblo, and this pueblo, by the way, is the oldest continuously inhabited building in the United States. About 1,000 years people have lived in this building. So this is an iconic photo by Ansel Adams, and then one of Tony Luhan also. Also, that summer, Los Gallos hosted the New England watercolorist John Marin, who was again famous for his Maine seacoast paintings. Marin was bowled over by the terrain of New Mexico And he painted over 100 watercolors of Taos Mountain and the great open spaces of northern New Mexico. And when he finally returned to the east, he complained of feeling hemmed in. Here's his painting of the Ranchos Church, which is, I think, the most painted church in all of the United States. During her years in New York, Mabel had known Alfred Stieglitz, though she knew his wife, Georgia O'Keeffe, less well. But Georgia O'Keeffe accepted Mabel's invitation to stay at one of the guest houses at Los Gallos. O'Keeffe's response to Taos was immediately positive, and she felt at home in the bare essentials of the landscape that came to define her work as an artist. Behind Mabel's house there was, and still is, a murata belonging to the penitentes, where there is a black cross. Georgia O'Keeffe was offended by the black cross, so she installed white cross just a short distance away from the black cross, which she then incorporated in one of her paintings. She was also well known for several paintings of the well-known Ranchos Church. The lives of Mabel, O'Keeffe, and D.H. Lawrence intersected, and Georgia was often a visitor to the Lawrence Ranch, where there was the tall pine tree close to the ranch house. Georgia O'Keeffe lay on the ground under the tree to make this painting. The tree still stands on the ranch. You can lie under it and do the same painting, but the painting itself is now in Albuquerque in the museum. The relationship between Mabel and Georgia was not always a peaceful one. These were two very strong women. When Mabel had to return to New York for a hysterectomy, Georgia agreed to write letters to Mabel from Tony. Though Tony Luhan could speak 5 different languages, he was unable to write in English. So Georgia wrote about all the sightseeing that she and Tony had been doing and how much time they had spent together in Mabel's absence. She also wrote Mabel letters of her own saying, "Oh, Tony is so manly, and the only person who could hold a candle to him would be my Stieglitz." So by the time Mabel recovered enough from surgery to make the 3-day train trip back to Taos, she was livid with anger at Georgia O'Keeffe. 25 years later, Mabel was still angry with O'Keeffe. Even though after Mabel's death, Georgia still recalled how much Tony and Mabel had loved one another. This antagonism and jealousy between Georgia and Mabel may well be the reason why Georgia O'Keeffe left Taos to move to Abiquiu. Maynard Dixon and his wife Dorothea Lang spent a year in Taos at Mabel's invitation, during which Dixon's work was profoundly influenced by the low horizons and marching cloud formations, as well as by life in the Pueblo. Documentary photographer Dorothea Lang did some work that influenced the photography that she later produced during the Depression. A very important literary figure who visited Mabel was Mary Austin, author of 32 books and hundreds of articles, many of which dealt with the Indians of the West. Tony Luhan was a wonderful guide for Mary Austin as she explored the region for material for her books, as well as for the survey of pueblos, which the Carnegie Foundation had hired her to do. Both Mary and Mabel played an important role in preserving Indian and Spanish crafts and establishing their values. They collected native blankets, pottery, furniture, santos, bultos, and hammered tin, and they sent some of their collections to galleries in New York, which created an interest in handmade colonial art and Indian art, and in preserving the best examples of folk art. It greatly increased the value of these items, but there was some controversy about the sale of religious items. One of Mabel's former friends from New York was John Collier, whom she convinced to visit Taos in the winter of 1920. Collier was disillusioned by the anti-immigrant feelings that ran high in the East after World War I, and Mabel hoped to interest John Collier in the concerns of the Indians of New Mexico. Through his friendship with Mabel, and through an introduction to Stella Atwood, who was the chair of the General Federation of Women's Clubs Indian Welfare Committee, Collier began research in 1922 into economic and health problems among the Pueblos, and what he found was horrifying. Indian children were being taken from their families and sent to boarding schools which were overcrowded, dirty, poorly run, and only 2 doctors treated all 10 of the Pueblos in northern New Mexico, and TB, trachoma, and venereal diseases were rampant. Indian lands, which had been given to the tribes by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, were being taken from them, and Indian culture and religion were being denigrated. And all of this was happening under the Bureau of Indian Affairs. In July 1922, Senator Burson of New Mexico introduced a bill in Congress which would have deprived the Pueblos of at least 60,000 acres of arable land. Under Collier, with the help of Mabel and Stella Atwood, a national campaign against the Burson bill began, and the protection of Indian lands became a cause for a coalition of artists, writers, activists, and reformers. Boy Scouts, Campfire Girls, social scientists, and 2 million women who were members of the Federation of Women's Clubs wrote letters and sent telegrams joining forces with the Catholic Bureau of Missions. Indians were sent to perform in Washington, D.C., and in New York, they went to the New York Stock Exchange, and the members of the exchange were reduced to silence when the Indians began playing their drums. Tony Luhan played a very important role by taking John Collier to all 19 pueblos in New Mexico to translate and to explain the provisions of the Burson bill. D.H. Lawrence wrote a piece on the bill which was published in the New York Times. It was during this time that Mabel was warned by several friends that the Justice Department planned to investigate her relationship with Tony and threatened her and publicized her relationship. So she became convinced that she and Tony needed to make their union legal under the law. So on April 23rd, 1923, Tony became her 4th and final husband. Eastern papers carried headlines such as, "Why Bohemia's Queen Married an Indian Chief." The Burson bill was killed in January 1923, but a substitute bill was proposed which offered no compensation to the Indians for their lands or for the water rights. So the new Secretary of the Interior called upon John Collier to help him quell the uproar over the Pueblo lands. And the resulting bill, the Pueblo Lands Act, made significant concessions to the Pueblos. 48,000 acres of Pueblo land, which had been taken by Teddy Roosevelt for the Carson National Forest, including the Blue Lake, the sacred Blue Lake, were finally returned to Taos Pueblo under the administration of President Nixon in 1970. And residents of the Pueblo today revere President Nixon because the sacred lake was finally returned to them, sacred Blue Lake. Mabel, Ganson, Evans, Dodge, Stern, Luhan is remembered as an influence on 2 continents, on the arts, on women's rights, and with her 4th husband, Tony Luhan, as a bridge between Anglo and Native American cultures. Mabel and Tony died within a few months of one another, but they're not buried together. Mabel's grave is in Kit Carson Park in Taos, while Tony was buried at the Taos Pueblo Cemetery. A documentary film titled Awakening in Taos, which was narrated by Allie McGraw, was funded by private and corporate donations, and it made its debut about 4 years ago in Taos, and PBS was supposed to have gotten enough funding to distribute all over the United States, but the funding fell through, so it did not get to every state. I don't believe it got to Texas. Jack and I were fortunate enough to be able to see it And some of the people who've been involved with making it were there in the audience. And following the film, questions were asked, and Tony Luhan's grandson was there. And someone said, was Mabel Dodge Luhan considered a home wrecker in the Pueblo? And Tony Luhan's grandson sort of evaded the answer, but he said in basis that she had done a lot of good for the Pueblo in raising interest in the medical situation, the education situation, in getting interest in the arts. And he also said that she paid his grandmother Candelaria a stipend for the rest of her life. I know that many of you have been to Taos, many of you have been to this house, and one of our members has painted a picture of it. Right here, Barbara Spain is sharing with a picture that she painted after a visit to Los Gallos. I have a couple of books by Mabel and one of her biographies, so if anybody's interested in borrowing those, I would be happy to let you borrow them. Any questions?
Did they have children?
Thank you for sharing.